Hello, my name is Kyle, and today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of the middle game in chess. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is two principles that we should always be thinking about in any position. The first one is the saying that loose pieces drop off. The second one is the principle of two weaknesses. So what does it mean, loose pieces drop off? Loose pieces drop off just means that if you have pieces that aren't defended, then you could get into trouble. For example, this knight on h5 is undefended. Also, this bishop on d6 is undefended. So you want to be careful, because if you have these pieces that are hanging that can be taken, then maybe your opponent's going to attack them. And this also ties into the second idea, the principle of two weaknesses. Each of these is considered a weakness. And here we have two weaknesses. So when we have two weaknesses, we want to be considering that possibly our opponent could take advantage of both of them. And if we're playing as white, we want to be thinking, okay, there's two weaknesses. Can I take advantage of both of these? If you can only take advantage of one weakness, then your opponent might be able to defend that weakness. But if you have two weaknesses, you might be in trouble. They might be able to take advantage of both of the weaknesses and you won't be able to defend them both in time. I like to say that if you have one loose piece, you have to be careful. If you have two loose pieces, you have to be really careful. And if you have three loose pieces, that's too many loose pieces for sure. But even two might be too many. So here actually, after the move bishop d6, white has an excellent move to take advantage of these two loose pieces. And one of them will drop off. So if you want to pause the video, you can see if you can find a way to attack both these pieces at the same time. Okay, and if you took a second, you hopefully found this move, queen to d1, right? This will attack both the bishop and the knight. Of course, it's not the most obvious move. It is a retreating move that actually attacks. But in this case, there's just no way to defend for black. And so we would definitely want to be, finding this if we can. But this is how all tactics begin, is your opponent is not defending everything, right? And oftentimes it's taking advantage of more than one weakness at a time, and your opponent can't defend all of them in time. So these two things are going to tie into every tactic just about that you get. And so you want to be paying very close attention to this in the middle game. But the middle game is not just tactics. The middle game is also strategy. And as the saying goes, tactics are what you do when there's something to do. Strategy is what you do when there's nothing to do. So a lot of players I know who are trying to learn the game, they say, well, Kyle, I understand tactics. I can calculate things. I get what moves I should play in the opening, but I get to the middle game and then I just don't know what to do. So let's look at a few example middle games to learn some basic strategy. Okay, so middle game 1 is a case of not having that much space and having a bad piece. So if we're looking at this from black's perspective, we see that black does not have very much space. And when you don't have that much space, you want to try and get rid of some of your pieces. If you can trade some of your pieces, then you're going to not struggle as much. So if you want to take a moment to pause the video and see if you can force a trade of pieces. If you force a trade of pieces, your remaining pieces won't be tripping over each other so much, and that will be good for your position. Okay, so if you've paused the video and you've looked, hopefully you came up with this move, knight to e5. You may have also come up with a move like knight to b6 or bishop to f4 or something like that, and those are also good moves. But knight to e5 actually forces the trade since we're attacking two pieces at once. They can simply save their bishop by bringing it back to e2, right? This was a loose piece, but there's only one loose piece, so it wasn't too bad. They were able to save it, right? Imagine if they were both loose, then they're going to lose a piece, right? Most likely. So here we can just trade knights, and now our position is less cramped. That was just kind of a 1 or 2 move plan, right? We just very quick plan, like, okay, I can trade pieces. That'll help my position. But now what do we do? Well, one, if we're looking for tactics, we can see actually that we can take this pawn here, by the way. Let's imagine we don't have that tactic. Let's imagine if we go back that they trade these knights right away, right? This is another possibility. Well, let's say they just do this and defend this pawn, right? No tactics, right? When we're thinking about what to do, we're thinking, I have something to do. I'm attacking things, but okay, now I don't really have anything to do. Well, if we don't have anything to do, we go back to strategy again. So what's another strategic idea we can try and play for? Well, we want to identify what our worst piece is and try and improve that piece. So if you want to take a moment to try and think of what our worst piece is and try and identify that piece. That's going to be a piece that has very few squares it can move to. Okay, so if you took a moment, hopefully you found that this bishop on c8 is a real problem piece. This is our worst piece. It only has one square it can go to. You may have also considered either of the rooks, and they're not very great either in this position. But if we, for example, moved our bishop to a6, we just teleported it over there, then our rooks would have more space to maneuver. And they would also be coordinating with each other. We want to coordinate our pieces and work as a team when we can. So if we could do that, we would improve our rooks as well. So let's figure out a plan to improve this bishop. And probably the simplest is just to play b6, bishop b7, and probably c5. And now this bishop will have a long diagonal, and already it has a target on e4 to attack. So now we've created another plan, and we'll know what to do for the next few moves at least, right? So our strategy, our plans, they don't always have to be super complicated things that take, forever to accomplish. They can be very short plans, and they don't have to involve that many tactics. This is a very just straightforward idea. We're just going to improve our piece. Okay, now let's move on to another example. Here we have a middle game where I want to talk about the idea of color complexes. So a color complex would be the dark squares or the light squares. And this is particularly important when discussing bishops. A bishop that's a dark square bishop is only ever going to be on the dark squares. It can only attack things on the dark squares, it can only defend things on the dark squares. So generally speaking, you want to put your bishop on the opposite color, or really I should say you want to put your pawns on the opposite color complex to your bishop. Of course, your bishop can't change, so your pawns have to change. And here we can see that white has some pawns on the dark squares, but also some on the light squares, and it's pretty even. Now, if we look at black's pieces, we see we have some pawns on the light squares, and we can even play this move c4, putting another pawn on a light square. And part of what's so great about this is that we are taking this away as a target, right? When we were on the dark squares, we could be attacked. On the light squares, we're impervious. We're invulnerable, right? This bishop can never take us on a light square, just not possible. And so we always want to be considering that. Sometimes we want to be on the dark squares to limit our opponent's bishop, but sometimes we want to be on the opposite color complex to our opponent to just take away those targets. So sometimes we stay on the same color complex to fight them. Sometimes we move off of that color complex so that we're safe. It depends on the scenario, but as long as we're considering that, we're usually going to be making the right decision. And with experience, you'll make more and more the right decision. And in this game, white didn't play so well and just kind of drifted into a worse position. We traded queens and then saving the rook, going to a8. We also notice another problem here, which is that sometimes you're going to have weaknesses in your pawn structure, and this move c4 also helped to fix these weaknesses, right? The b pawn cannot move, and the b pawn is also a weakness, by the way, because it's a backwards pawn. And now here, white just lost their a pawn. And actually this went into an endgame. And that's something to consider always in the middle game, is that if I go into an endgame, is it going to be beneficial to me? So our middle game strategy and our middle game ideas are always going to also take into account the end game. What's going to happen after this, right? Is this good that I go into an end game here as black? Yes, because later black played the move g6, and all of the black pawns were on light squares and were impossible to attack for the dark square bishop. And this backwards b pawn eventually fell. It was eventually taken by the knight, and this endgame was just not really possible to hold. At first, it doesn't look like it's so bad, but in the long run, it was just not defensible. So we want to be considering the color complexes here. So now we have some more exciting middle games, actually. we have the kind of middle game that I like to refer to as a race, where we are racing our opponent to accomplish something. And if we're too slow, we can even lose the game because our opponent is just accomplishing their goals much faster than we are. So in this position, our pawns are actually going to lead the way. So if we look at our pawns are pointing towards the queen side, and black's pawns are pointing towards the king side. So what does this mean? Well, we want to play on the queen side and our opponent wants to play on the king side. We're racing to either get a pawn across the board and make a queen, or to win some material, maybe some pawns, maybe a rook or something. And they're racing to checkmate our king, right? To somehow destroy the cover around our king and checkmate us. So these are really exciting positions. And the reason why the pawns point in the direction you want to play in is because that's where your pawn breaks are going to be. You always want to be considering your pawn breaks in the middle game. So here, white's pawn break is c5 and black's pawn break is g4. Both of them aren't possible right away. For example, if white just played c5, oh, it's black's turn. But if black played g5 here, but if white just played c5, for example, well, it might be playable, but it also might not be because there's some defenders here and I don't know. I don't know if this is what we want, right? So in the game, white played b4 and later c5. And you want to be careful not to stop your own play. Black played g5, which is a good move, aiming to play g4. But then after something like rook c1, preparing this even more, getting ready, black played h4 and stopped their ability to play g4. So this is not what you want to do. You want to break open things and get at this king, right? This is the pawn break, not this. That just blocks things down. So in this game, white went on to win. Eventually, white created a weakness on d6, a backwards pawn, like we saw with that b pawn in the last example, and just won this pawn. And eventually, these two pawns, I believe it was these two, just ran across and made a queen. So you want to be careful not to stop your own play in these sorts of situations. But the main thing is to consider when your pawns are pointing in a direction, the big thing to take away here is you want to play in that direction. If your pawns are saying, hey, go after this king, go after that king and try and checkmate him, even if you have to sacrifice material, keep that in mind. Sacrifices are a big part of the middle game. That's why Spielman said play it like a magician, because it's not logical always, right? Sometimes you just give away material and you try and blow things up, basically, right? So very fun, exciting positions. But if you play something like h4, right? Now white has all the fun and black has no fun because g4 is no longer possible. So our final middle game today that we'll look at is another position where we're racing. And this one may be, I don't know, to some people it might be simpler, to some people it might be more complicated, but it's a different kind of race. In this situation, we're not racing to accomplish different goals. In the last one we were racing, one of us was trying to checkmate the other, one of us was trying to get an extra queen or something like that. In this case, we're both going for checkmate. This is what's known as an opposite side castling scenario, right? And this comes out of the Sicilian here. This is one of the most common openings you'll be playing if you get this sort of middle game. But it could happen in a few different positions. And the idea is, because our kings are on opposite sides, we have no problems pushing the pawns, right, on each side of the board to try and go checkmate our opponent's king. If our king was on g1, for example, pushing g4 or h4 makes our king less safe, right? But since our king's on c1, it doesn't do anything to our king, right? He's perfectly safe. And I'll mention here, the player who was playing as white here was Mikhail Tal, one of the best attacking players of all time, and of course, a world champion. He played the move h4. And just like we were talking about earlier, material's not so important when you're racing. You want to be as fast as you can be. And here, something like bishop takes h4 is a terrible mistake, because after queen h3, bishop to f6 again, what white would have played in this scenario, and maybe you didn't even have to pause it. It is a very straightforward threat, right? White just plays the move. Queen takes h7. Checkmate. If you didn't see that, no worries. You just want to always be remembering in these kind of positions that we are playing for checkmate at all times. So any move here is going to be in the service of getting a checkmate. It's a race. So we're playing to checkmate white, white's playing to checkmate us. We're playing to black. So we want to be focused solely on defense or offense for the kings. And in fact, again, these are racing positions, so rook b8 is the best move here from Tal's opponent. Although, of course, Tal still won. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. If you feel like you missed anything, feel free to rewind the video, watch it over again, let the ideas really sink in. And if you want to dive even further into chess middle games, feel free to hop into a live lesson, and I'll see you next time. Bye.